Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I hope you're going to get yourself a perfect, delicious, lovely warm drink, or something effervescent and fizzy or sparkling, or perhaps something still. It depends on what kind of mood you're in, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, growing up I was naturally timorous, shy, rather self-effacing, which was ironic. I came from a family who was anything but, especially my mother. Suffice to say, perhaps it was my parents, being so confidently assertive, that made me shrink back into the shadows, like a tortoise retreating to the safe confines of its shell. Let's just say my mother could make my cheeks burn, with some of the outrageous off-the-cuff things she would say. I think my brother Knox, who was 2 years my junior, had also become a shrinking violet, due to my parents' blatant impertinence. "Why did Mum have to be so embarrassing today?" he would say, even when he was only 7 at the time. My brother had been upset by the way my mother was repetitively challenging his teacher, like asking her why my brother had drawn 2 suns in the sky in his artwork. "Don't you think it means something, Mrs. Rogers?" she had said to Knox's teacher. "Surely you appreciate the hidden messages in children's artwork. It's a reflection of what's going on in their heads." Even skilled psychologists acknowledge this. "My son has drawn 2 suns. Now, it's not normal for a child to draw 2 suns. I think it's very symbolic, don't you? It means something, doesn't it? You as a teacher should be able to discern what it means. Children speak through their art, do they not?" "Look, Mrs. Dean, I'm no psychologist. I wish I was. I'm just a school teacher. I'm sure you understand that. I sincerely doubt it means anything significant, drawing 2 suns. Maybe Knox just likes the sunshine. It's just art. Children express themselves in my classes with paint. It doesn't have to mean anything, does it? If your son wants to draw 2 suns, it's up to him. It doesn't actually mean a thing." "Oh, but you're wrong, Mrs. Rogers," my mother had insisted. "Let's see what my son has to say about this." Before Knox knew what was happening, he was being hauled over by my mother, who was pointing accusingly at the 2 suns he'd just drawn. "Why did you draw 2 suns, Knox?" my mother had asked my brother, in front of the art teacher, who wore a wide-eyed expression on her face that read, "I can't believe this is actually happening. I've seen some weird parents in my time, but this woman, she's about as idiosyncratic and as outrageous as you can get. A real interfering busybody who doesn't know what the heck she's talking about." My brother trembled, his little face looking up at the 2 adults incredulously. "I like the sun," he explained. "If there are 2 suns in the sky, then you know it's going to be an even better day." Mrs. Rogers looked up at my mother and smiled. "There you are. There's your answer. I guess that the sun means that your son has a very sunny outlook." My mother's voice sounds triumphant. "There you go, Mrs. Rogers. My son did not draw 2 suns for no reason. I think I've made my point very clear." And at that she grabbed my brother's hand and stomped out of the classroom with an air of belligerence. "Honestly," my mother said, "she's an art teacher. You'd think she'd be a wee bit more perceptive." Let's just say both my parents were well known in our small town, and shyness had never ingratiated itself towards their lives. For if shyness had been an item of clothing, it would have been thrown out and discarded with the dirty bathwater a very long time ago. My mother was known by the residents of our small community as the biggest gossip, with very strong opinions about things, and she wore that claim to fame like a badge of honour on her lapel, as if it was something to be marvelled and valued greatly. My mother considered herself as astute and as sharp as a voucher, for she never missed a beat. She'd notice minuscule details about people that was nothing short of astonishing, and so in that regard she could be likened to an American version of Hercule Poirot, who was female and of course did not speak with a Belgian accent. If you want to know the little details my mother picked up about people, there were too many to count, like the time she noticed our vicar was no longer holding his wife's hand when he sat down in the congregation, when someone was reading a passage of scripture, something that no one else had perceived in those scant moments. My mother's sharp eyes had picked up the clandestine, reluctant body language between the pastor and his wife, and instantly smelt a rat. She would tell much of the congregation over tea after the service, when everyone gathered around for coffee and cake, that something was seriously off with the vicar's marriage. "They're definitely at war with each other," she said defiantly. "They're sleeping in separate bedrooms. They haven't spoken to each other for weeks. I assure you they'll be filing for divorce very shortly. Just you wait and see." As you can imagine, many folk in our small town were naturally exceedingly protective over the vicar and his wife, and were outraged at my mother's cursory comments. My mother despised political correctness in every form, and allowed the words to gush forwards from her mouth like a crystal-clear spring. My mother was never rude or mean to people, but she was an open book. "Now that's not a nice thing to say, Merrill," people would spout at her indignantly. "The pastor and his wife are solid. You're barking up the wrong tree there. And even if you're right, and you picked up some tension between the two of them, and hypothetically, even if they did have a spat, I'm certain they'll make up soon. After all, the vicar is a man of God. He'd never willingly just throw his marriage down the pan like that." I do not exaggerate my mother's efficiency and unparalleled skill at seeing things others failed to discern, as lo and behold, a short while later, the news hit our town like a bucket of ice-cold water being flung over people's beleaguered faces, when our long-suffering vicar announced to his saddened congregation that he and his wife were getting divorced. It was repetitive incidents like this that made people pay attention to my mother, sit up and notice, and never take what she was saying with just a pinch of salt. Instead, they secretly marvelled at how ingenuously shrewd and sharp-witted she actually was. On one occasion my mother observed someone's 16-year-old daughter was hiding a pregnancy from her own parents. She could see the young girl's reticent body language retreating into the shadows, hiding her bump under loose layers of clothing, but my mother knew she was pregnant before anybody else did. She told the girl's parents, who discovered that indeed their young girl did have a bun in the oven. They hadn't even noticed a thing. They had failed to observe their daughter's furtive behaviour, and the way her wardrobe had changed so significantly. Instead, they assumed she'd just picked up a little weight, and that her strange moods were simply down to a pugnacious teenager being exceedingly difficult. My mother had a long-standing joke with us, and always would tell us that what she didn't know was not worth knowing. It was probably true. If my father had any skeletons in his cupboard, my mother would have dragged them out a long time ago, as my dad pretty much knew that in our household there could be no secrets that were successfully tucked away and buried masterfully like a squirrel's stash of acorns for the winter. Not a chance. My mother would find them out. She would say things to my dad like, "Who were you having lunch with today at work? You were seen at the diner with a rather smart, well-spoken man with grey hair, wearing a pinstriped suit. Who was he? I got the impression he was from out of state. And was your subordinate? Were you showing him the ropes? Is that what it was all about?" My father would roll his eyes in the back of his head, clap his hands, and say, "How the hell did you know that, sweetheart? Yes, I did have lunch today, if you must know. He's managing the main offices of our Atlanta branch. He is my subordinate from out of state, but he's up here to gain some pointers from me. How on earth do you know this?" "I just know," my mother would say, with a bright twinkle in her eyes and a short tap on the edge of her nose. "Let's just say I have my sources." My father shakes his short-cropped head of brown hair and chuckles. He looks at my mother lovingly through his steely grey eyes. "Jolly good thing I'm not having an affair. I'd never hear the end of it. My dirty laundry would be so conspicuous everyone in town would know all about it, all the grisly details. You know what, sweetheart? You should have been a private detective. You're wasted as a housewife." My mother looked at my father with wide eyes, as if his words had struck a chord with her. She grabbed my dad's arm fiercely. She gave it a tight squeeze. "Philip," she said, "why didn't I think about it before? That's a brilliant idea." "What are you talking about, sweetheart?" says my father. "What did I say?" "Never you mind," says my mother. But my father knew. "Never you mind" meant I've got a great idea up my sleeve. My brother and my father audibly groaned. We all knew my mother was up to something. Merrill, my mother. I will admit that I'm known as the town busybody, or gossip, although some have likened me to Hercule Poirot, the Belgian detective. The latter is a compliment I don't take lightly. As for being classified as a gossip, I'm not offended by this either. It was never meant to be obnoxious or mean-spirited. Well, I hope it's not anyway. People call me a gossip, as I know things about them. I'm not shy in making these observations known, but I do bridle myself, even suppress what I know, lest I should cause offence, as nothing I willingly say is ever intended to cause hurt. I have grown men coming up to me sometimes, asking me if I think their wife is having an affair. I can look at the woman in question, and in a short space of time give the man a definitive yes or no. It is in the details, the tiny, minuscule, seemingly benign details, that can tell you an awful lot about a person. I have found human behaviour, facial expressions and gestures are a rich treasure trove of gleaming information, a minefield of revelation, a mirror of insight. For me, it's not difficult to read between the lines. I think reading people is a gift. I acquired this from a very young age. I see things in people others don't. I believe it's called reading body language. It has absolutely nothing to do with being psychic in any way. It is about harnessing your intuition, your gut. It's about being alert to human behaviour. I have a friend, for example, whose daughter was struggling through school, whereas her other two daughters sailed through their grades. I remember my friend was desperately sad, believing her young daughter would never amount to anything in life. I turned around to her and said, "Your failing daughter is going to be the star in your family." Of course, I was absolutely right. It would seem the two sisters have pretty mediocre jobs these days, but the failing kid at school is running a cosmetics empire single-handedly. I think my sleuth-like tendencies were birthed naturally from a very young age. Growing up as a young girl in Chicago, I would spend my days with my mother, who was a stay-at-home housewife in those days. My mother, like the vast majority of her peers, would stay at home to man the fort, to take care of the domestic considerations like cooking, cleaning and childcare duties. That was what it was like back then in the 50s, and as far as I can recall, no one quibbled, moaned or complained about it at all. It was what we did. Women stayed at home, men went out to work. I don't recall any of the women feeling demeaned about being a housewife. In those days my mother would host the most fabulous tea parties for her friends. That would be like something you might see in Downton Abbey, where she would lay out a sumptuous spread of tiny paper-thin, finger-sized cucumber sandwiches, Boston loaf spread with butter, jam and cream scones, chocolate cake, and Victoria sponge oozing with jam and cream. In those days the young women were very well dressed, wearing flowery cotton dresses with miniature belts around their middles, as this was the way the 50s dressed. So gathering around for tea was a social way of catching up with your friends, and believe me, those women could gossip. This social getting together like this was infinitely better than social media sites today. There really is no comparison in my opinion. I remember they would say things like, "You'll never believe what happened the other day," or "Boy, have I got something to tell you that will make your hair curl." I remember I would be sitting there on the floor next to my mother's legs, pretending to be fully absorbed with playing with my doll, but my ears would be on full alert. They were flapping like a pigeon's wings. Good job nobody noticed. I would listen to the conversation, watch the body language of my mother's friends, and let's just say I learnt a whole lot about other people. I would point out details to my mother that would surprise even her. "Don't you think it's strange, Mummy, that Lydia's wearing a different perfume today?" My mother had chuckled at me and said, "Why on earth is that strange, dear? You do say some peculiar things sometimes." She had ruffled my curly blonde hair affectionately with her fingers. "Lydia's allowed to change her perfume, is she not? Last time I looked, it was a free country we're living in. But, Mummy, don't you remember she told you once that she would never ever change her perfume, that the spicy fragrance is her husband's signature favourite? Well, dear, maybe she's bored of the fragrance now and was trying something brand new. Possibly someone bought her a gift, so she put it on her pulse points for a change. Personally, I'd hate to always smell the same. But you're not Lydia, I pointed out. What about her wedding band? She wasn't wearing it today, was she? My mother grabbed my arm tightly, looked at me intently in the eyes. You noticed that? She wasn't wearing her wedding band. Are you sure about this? Are you absolutely sure? Of course I'm sure, Mummy. It wasn't on her finger. We've got to go to Lydia's now, my mother had said, grabbing me by the hand and dashing out of the house as quickly as she could. I remember she drove over to Lydia's house at lightning speed, parking her car in a higgledy-piggledy fashion in her driveway. She dashed to the front door, didn't even bother to knock, but scrambled into Lydia's kitchen like an overexcited dog. Lydia was in the kitchen having coffee when me and my mother burst through the doorway, giving the poor woman the shock of her life. Believe me, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Her eyes were as round as saucers. What are you doing here, Emma? You scared the living daylights out of me. Next time you might just consider knocking, will you? My mother ignored Lydia's sarcastic comments and went straight for the jugular, determined to get some answers. Lydia, what's going on? Why have you changed your perfume? Why are you not wearing your wedding band? What's going on with you and Frank? Is there something you're not telling me? Lydia had burst into tears, while my mother had held her in her arms and rocked her like a baby. Why didn't you say anything at the tea party? Why did you keep so quiet? We're your friends. You know you can talk to us. I couldn't, says Lydia, choking back the tears. I just couldn't. I knew I'd break down in front of everyone. Lydia confessed to my mother she was going through a bad patch in her marriage, which was why she had abandoned the fragrance and also the wedding band. I can't believe you noticed those details, she told my mother. I'm so touched. You really are a good friend. You don't expect your friends to notice you're not wearing your wedding band. It's not me that noticed, Lydia. It was Meryl. She's a sharp one, that daughter of mine. I'm so scared that Frank is going to leave me, Lydia bursts out. Why would he do that, asks my mother, staring at Lydia in horror. You and Frank are as thick as thieves. If the two of you can't sort out your differences, there's not much hope for the rest of us. You're the one with the marriage that most aspired to. What on earth happened? He asked me if I had any change in my purse. I told him to go and help himself. That's when he discovered a business card with a man's telephone number on it, saying, "Call me. Let's have coffee sometime." I'd been meaning to throw the card away. Of course I had. I wasn't interested in this stranger at all. But it was like Frank became so inflamed. He told me I should never have kept the card, that I must have secretly been interested in the man. He was desperately hurt. He refused to even sleep in the same bedroom as me. He told me he couldn't trust me any more. Is that all? Oh, my word, it is extreme. It sounds like Frank is making a mountain out of a molehill out of nothing. You're an attractive woman, for goodness sake. Surely he knows you might occasionally have a man dishing you out a business card. Why is he so insecure? That's not the point. Frank thinks it means something that I kept the card. I'm worried he's going to leave me. He's so upset with me. I've never seen him like this before. He stomps into the house like a belligerent bull terrier, virtually growling at me, and then bogs off. Even at such a young age, I remember chuckling. He's not going to leave you. He's just jealous, but he'll calm down. My mother and her friend Lydia had stared at me, with nonplussed expressions on their faces. So young, Lydia had piped, but so clever. Of course, I'd been absolutely right. Lydia and Frank resolved their differences, while Lydia made sure she threw out any business cards that were ever given to her by strangers to avoid any discord between her and her husband Frank from ever erupting again, as she had unduly learnt that Frank and the green-eyed monster were very well acquainted with each other. I do remember on one of my mother's tea parties, which on this occasion was actually a book club, where her friends would agree to meet to discuss the book they were reading. On this occasion they were discussing Daphne du Maurier's book, Rebecca, that was published, I think, in 1937, or thereabouts. My mother's good friend Gladys arrives at the tea party, looking so dishevelled, with hair all over the place, grass sticking out of her black poodle haircut, as if she's been hijacked by a haystack, or the farmer had accidentally mistaken her for a scarecrow to plonk in the field to scare off his crows. Believe me, looking like that, she could have scared away the birds in a heartbeat. The very sight of her scared the book club, holding them captive to a profound astonishment. I mean, there was mud spread across her pale skin, like splashes of a clay face mask, along with a plethora of scratches all over her face and body, that looked like she'd become personally acquainted with a bush of thorny briars, or had an unfortunate altercation with a less than domesticated household tabby. There was grazing on her knees, as if she'd taken a fortuitous tumble, an open bleeding scab, along with a plethora of bruises and scratches everywhere you looked on her. Worse still, her once pretty dress was drenched in mud, covered in burrs and briars, bespeckled with droplets of blood, shredded badly, in all its parts, snagged by thorns. It was like her dress was almost as battered as she was. It had taken a serious punneling, as if it had been worn away in an aggressive tumble-dryer. It was hanging around her in limp shreds and rags, resembling crepe paper, barely covering her legs at all. You could almost see her knickers beneath. If you had known Gladys like we did at the time, you would have known she would never have been seen dead, looking the way she did on this occasion. Something really bad must have transpired for her to overlook her appearance like this, and rock up at our front door, looking exactly like something the cat dragged in. Gladys had always taken so much pride in her appearance, was always meticulously turned out, very well presented. She was the kind of proud woman who never had a hair out of place. Her ruby lipstick looked like it had been painted on her lips by Michelangelo himself. She was such a punctilious, well-groomed person. I'd been to her house once and deliberately run my hands over everything. Surely I would find a speck of dust, I thought, somewhere, or even a cobweb, perhaps, but not a chance. I would secretly marvel to myself that anyone could be this neat. But Gladys always amazed me. She ran her house seamlessly. Even the books in her bookshelf were placed strategically in a methodical alphabetical order. There was nothing out of place in her home. When my mother opened the door to Gladys, with her dog at her side, I think she was half Yorkshire Terrier and some other fluffy toy breed, but even the dog that was normally as pristine as her owner looked like it had been dragged through the hedge backwards. Worse still, it was covered in mud and smelt pungently vile, so much so I almost wanted to hurl up the contents of my stomach. Had the dog been rolling in cow manure and decomposing flesh, I wondered? My mother stood in the doorway, with me standing by her side. We gawked at poor Gladys, as we'd never seen her look like this before. She was a dishevelled mess. My mother could see Gladys was trying to fight back tears, but her resolve was not strong enough. They trickled down her face as if the floodgates had been opened, but her tears were silent and not accompanied by any sobs. My mother took Gladys lovingly into her arms, patting her reassuringly on her back, leading her into the kitchen. "I could have died," she cried in my mother's arms. "But you didn't, did you?" my mother had said. "You and Bo Peep are safe here now. You've got nothing to worry about. You're among your friends here." There, my mother had said comfortingly. She insisted that Gladys sit back on our breakfast nook. She gave her a tot of brandy. "Drink that," she ordered. "It'll help you with the shock." Gladys had knocked back 3 tots of brandy, which wasn't bad going for someone who's not inclined to drink. The alcohol did seem to calm her down, although she never said a single word. Needless to say, all the ladies in the book club entered the kitchen. They began helping Gladys by fussing around her, cleaning up her grazes, attending to her scratches on her face and body, while removing the grass from her hair. Everyone was asking what happened, but Gladys didn't answer any of the questions. For a while it was as if the cat had got her tongue, or maybe she just did not want to talk. My mother said that the latter was probably true, as shock can literally hijack your voice box as you try to come to terms with what transpired, so it suppresses your desire to talk. My mother ran Gladys a hot bath and told her to have a long soak, while she washed little Bo Peep, whom also appeared to be filthy. His breath stank of death and decay, and of decomposing, rotting vegetables. The smell was obnoxiously offensive. My mother found a spare toothbrush and paste and attempted to brush his teeth to get rid of the atrocious smell. To date, I have never smelt a breath so repugnant. Finally, Gladys looked halfway human again, apart from the scratches and bruising on her face, but she looked a lot cleaner. She joined the rest of the group, wearing one of my mother's fresh cotton smocks, covered in pretty yellow sunflowers, with a matching thin yellow belt. My mother had brushed her hair until it gleamed, given her a touch of lipstick. With her now clean dog by her side, wearing a yellow ribbon in his hair, with a breath that smelt strongly of mint, people began to relax, drinking tea and eating cake, choosing not to cross-examine Gladys, as they sensed that she was not eager to talk. But halfway through the tea, Gladys broke the silence. She randomly spouted, "I had a nasty fall. I fell into a hedge of thorns." "What happened, Gladys?" everyone chorused together, sensing that now she was willing to talk. Gladys nibbled at an egg sandwich and said, "The trouble is, if I tell you what happened, I'm not sure you're going to actually believe me. If I was wearing your shoes, I wouldn't. But hands on heart, it is the absolute truth." "You know us, Gladys. You can tell us anything. We know you don't lie. Out with it, girl." Gladys glanced around at each and every one of us. She seemed reassured by her attentive audience, with their unmasked, earnest expressions. She spoke at first with a measure of hesitancy and reluctance. Then, as she grew more audaciously confident, like a horse in an exercise ring that has suddenly found its bearings, she gallops along with her story, and every eye in that room was fixed on her. No one batted an eyelid, flicked an eyelash, twitched a finger, wiggled a spoon, or chewed a morsel. Ears were alert to her every word. "Well, I got up early this morning to take Bo Peep for her morning walk. I always do that. I left our farmhouse, trundled down the long white dirt road outside our property, and took the left-hand turning to the red maple wood grove. You know, the one that Farmer Matt lets everyone use to walk their dogs." Everyone nods. "One of the best wood groves, without a doubt," my mother confesses. "Our dogs love it there." Well, it was such a beautiful, sparkling morning. Bo Peep was running off her lead. She was sniffing everything like she always does. There isn't a single area in the woodgrove that has not been marked by her scent, I'm afraid. Bo Peep lacks modesty. She has no shame. She anoints everything with her golden showers, as if baptizing the entire forest. The ethereal light this morning that was dancing through the canopy, it was so pretty. The pathway resplendently dappled with the golden glaze of recently fallen leaves. It looked magical, beguiling, as if we were walking down a path made of gold. The wind blew up many of those autumn leaves from the oak trees that were flying in the air like golden confetti, while the boughs of the trees were swaying up and down, as though the trees themselves were dancing. I was feeling blissfully happy, very, very contented, thinking about all the points I wanted to raise about Daphne du Maurier's book Rebecca, which I've been thoroughly enjoying reading. In a trice, Bo Peep, who usually only runs a few feet ahead of me, as she's a well-behaved, good-natured dog, begins to behave paradoxically. She seems capricious, rebelliously incompliant. Her tail is wagging at 1,000 miles an hour. She obstinately bolts into the woods with a bull-headed determination and obstreperous disobedience, so that she's nowhere to be found or seen. I begin to panic. Anxiety courses through my veins, as Bo Peep has never ever behaved so incongruously before. Never just run off like this so willfully and abandon me like this. I call after her, then I catch sight of her running towards me, with something in her mouth that she's holding on to for dear life. I knew it was another unmentionable. I regret to confess that Bo Peep has a ghastly unfavourable habit of picking up dead carcasses, most usually of birds, mice and rabbit, all the time. It's a major deal for me to extract them from her mouth. She clamps down on her dead packages with a disobliging jaw, like a pugnacious crocodile. She growls at me roguishly like a Rottweiler dog, so assertively that I'm almost sure she'll bite me. Of course she never does, but she puts up a convincing show nevertheless. Somehow I always manage to get out the thing from her jaw by using the edge of a stick. This time the thing that fell out of her mouth was 3 human fingers attached together. There was a long, drawn-out silence among my mother's friends. You could have almost heard a pin drop. as everyone tried to assimilate what Gladys was actually telling them. There were mixed reactions and gasps from my mother's friends, who were gulping down this revelation with difficulty, like trying to swallow a ping-pong ball, with little success. "Bloody hell! Your dog had 3 fingers in her mouth! Human fingers! Are you being serious?" "That's right," says Gladys. "At first I thought the fingers weren't real. It seemed too far-fetched that they could be. But after I poked them with the stick, I knew they were real. The nail bed had been badly gnawed, as if the owner of those fingers was a nervous person, and bit their nails. I was freaking out on seeing these fingers, but I didn't scream as you might expect. My heart just thundered in my chest, as I knew that if my dog had found 3 fingers, there had to be a corpse lying there in the forest. I knew I was going to have to turn around and retreat, going to the police station to tell them what I'd uncovered. But let's just say Bo Peep was not an obliging participant in this enigmatic discovery. She had other ideas, better ideas, and despite my best efforts to get her to heel, she willfully ignored me all over again and dashed back into the woodgrove, with me following behind her, calling her name. But would she listen? Not a chance. That's when I see my Bo Peep. She's filthy, caked in mud, scrambling through mud under this hedgerow, making the strange noise that emanates from the back of her throat. She's pawing and digging at the ground, and I can only imagine what must be decomposing human remains. "Bo Peep, stop that right now!" I cry out. "Stop that, Bo Peep, now!" But of course my dog is uncooperative today. She's rascally excited about what is lurking beneath that bush. I don't have to be a rocket scientist to guess what it is. It is the undeniable smell and stench of death, decay, and decomposition, which reveals all to me. There is such a putrid odour that's coming from underneath that hedgerow, unlike anything I've ever smelt before. It's vile. I actually run backwards, clasping my hands over my nose and mouth, and then I find myself falling over the edge of this embankment, right into a bramble bush. And when I say into a bramble bush, I mean it quite literally. I land bang in the middle of a bramble bush, which probably saved me from almost certain death, as I could have fallen back on some jagged rocks in the valley below. My hair is encased with needles, my dress and everything, and the more I move my body, the more scratched I become. This time Bo Peep has dashed down the embankment and is barking at me as I'm caught up in the middle of the hedgerow. She barks and barks and barks and barks, and that's when I see her. "Oh, you saw another dog walker," said my mother. "What a relief! You mean Bo Peep alerted the dog walker to your entangled body caught up in a hedge of briars? What a stroke of luck! At least Bo Peep got their attention. No, this was not a dog walker. This was something else. So human, but not human. I don't know what she was." "What do you mean, human but not human? What are you talking about?" my mother asks. Gladys hesitates for a moment. Her eyes dart from one of my mother's friends to another, finally to me. This is the part of the story I don't actually expect you to believe. And if you don't believe me, I won't take offence. But I will say this to you, that what I'm telling you now is absolutely 100% true. I'm lying there in the middle of this bush, incarcerated by the thorny briars, trying carefully to untangle my clothes from the thorns. But as I release my clothes from a few jagged, jutting appendages, I get hooked onto still more thorns that are snagging and tearing angrily into my clothes with fierce cutting edges that spare no regard for human flesh. I know I'm in a deep pickle, as releasing myself from this hedgerows is going to be a nightmare of note. Every single part of my body is stinging and burning from the scratches, and the more I try to free myself from this thorny trap, the more I get caught up and ensnared by these angry, vicious, jagged hooks. It's then I see this figure staring down at me. She's humongous. I'd say she's equivalent in size to 4 200-pound men, and I'm not exaggerating either. I know she's female, as she possesses a pair of firm breasts that are small in size. I mean, she's built like a solid concrete building, with shoulders at least 4 feet across. She must have been between 8 to 9 foot tall, about 800 pounds, and covered from head to toe with long flowing dark hair that has an auburn undertone that is terribly pretty. "But what was this creature?" asks my mother. I don't know, says Gladys, but the only way I would describe her to you is that she was incredibly human, apart from her great size. She had a pyramid-shaped head, burly proportions, overlong arms, but her face, oh my word, her face was so human. She had these yellow gold eyes, but they were kind. The next thing I know is that she reaches towards me and just pulls me off the hedgerow. Although my dress tears on some of those thorns, she rips me away like a piece of Velcro, throws me over her shoulders like a sack of potatoes, and carries me to the top of the embankment, with Bo Peep following dutifully behind. Then, using her huge hands, she brushes off my thorns and examines some of my scratches, when she's finally placed me on the ground, of course. She speaks to me in a foreign language, a brief scattering of words I don't understand. But I think she's saying to me, "You'll be all right now." She pats me on the back, gives me a kind nod, and just glides away, just like that. I watch her moving. Oh my God, it's like watching someone floating on air. She moves with such grace. "Bloody hell," says my mother. "That is some story. I wonder what she was. An angel, perhaps. I mean, she came to your rescue, did she not?" Everyone is nonplussed by Gladys's account, but they know her too well to doubt her story, as Gladys does not know how to lie or make up fantastical stories. She's not exactly blessed with a vivid imagination. Anyway, later that day, the police were dutifully informed about the 3 fingers that Bo Peep had retrieved from the woodgrove, the putrid smell from under the bush, where Bo Peep had been digging. It would seem that the police discovered the remains of a local man who had gone missing in the area. It was discovered he'd been shot with a hunting rifle. Later, a man came forward, admitting that his friend had confessed to the killing. He had been hunting and had shot at something he thought was a deer, only to discover to his horror that he'd killed a man. In a blind panic, he'd fled the scene. It was a relief for the family to be able to grieve their lost loved one and have a burial for him. The hunter was charged with involuntary manslaughter and ordered to do some community service. So with a good lawyer, he did get off scot-free. So perhaps you can see why some of my mother's tea parties back in the good old days of the early 50s was infinitely more interesting than playing with my dolls. I really decided that I loved listening to adults, as they always talked about fascinating things. I pondered for a long time about the red maple woodgrove that was ironically filled more with oak trees than maples, where Gladys had encountered that strange hairy humanoid, as the subject aroused in me a great sense of intrigue. I think I was born with inquisitive as my second name. Even my mother realized from a very young age that I preferred hanging around with adults, which was why growing up I never had any kiddie friends of my own, and was very alert to the idiosyncrasies of adult behaviour, from which I gained so much insight. So this is part 1 of our story. It goes on to part 2, and we have another Bigfoot encounter, a little bit more of a grumpy one, shall we say, or a bit intimidating, and it's a very exciting story, so don't forget to tune in tomorrow night. Until next time, goodbye and good night.